Historia for a Decolonial Latinx Feminism. The haunting of the ghost of La Llorona beckons us to bear witness to these open and still festering wounds. Emerging from the intimacies of the colonial encounter and the ongoing afterlives of colonization, I argue that her haunting holds lessons for taking up the task of decolonial feminisms. Centering the question, who does Llorona cry for today? In this talk, I want to think with you about what it might mean to faithfully bear witness to the demands of a 500-year-old haunting that refuses colonial forgettings of the heridas abiertas of settler coloniality. So just a few words about the organization of the talk. I want to spend a little time talking about my frameworks. So I'm going to speak about this concept of orienting historias that I'm developing, as well as the concept of faithful witnessing from Latinx decolonial feminists. Then in the next part of the talk, I am going to think a little bit about this phrase, somos lloronas, as I prompt us to think a little bit about a decolonial feminist politics of mourning. And then hopefully, if I have enough time to end, thinking a little bit about justice and revenge as we think about what is being demanded of us through this engagement with this story and legend. All right, so a little bit about my frameworks. The stories that we learn are often passed to us as children and are carried in our social imaginaries. That is, the images, myths, culture, and community histories that shape our everyday lives. Indeed, stories can be an orienting force for one's worlds and senses of self. For more than 500 years, the story of La Llorona has persisted and been passed on, reshaped and retold in thousands of ways by generations of Latinxes. More than just mere entertainment or a scary bedtime story, I want to suggest that the persistence of her legend speaks directly to these deeply held and felt wounds that remain present in the everyday lives of Latinxes, forming a counter-archive that testifies to collective experiences of sexualized, racialized, and gendered violence and dispossession that have been repressed by the colonial imaginary. And so it's for this reason that I appeal to La Llorona as an orienting historia, which is to say an instructive and guiding story and history that offers lessons for engaging in the work of decolonial feminisms. My own theorization of orienting historias builds from what Christy Dotson has called orienting stories. In her essay on the way to decolonization in a settler colony, Dotson offers an auto-philosophical reflection on how her own Black feminist politics originate with what she describes as orienting stories. She conveys the power of orienting stories by sharing two family memories, lovingly told to her by her parents, that recount her ancestors' freedom struggles. Dotson describes how these stories oriented her identity and generated what she describes as, quote, a memory that extends beyond my lifespan, close quote. Sharing one of these stories, she reflects, quote, I was raised to respect my aunt, who bore mutilation for freedom and claimed it no price at all. No price at all. And there's a morality to this memory that I don't expect other people to understand. These stories and many others besides are a part of my orienting stories, close quote. Dotson's orienting stories hold both real and speculative dimensions, passing on blueprints for Black survivance that are oriented by an ethics of community care. For Dotson, the historical veracity and verifiability of these orienting stories is less important than the lessons that they impart to her about ethics, praxis, and the stakes of liberation. Indeed, Dotson draws a direct connection between these orienting stories and her Black feminist politics. As she asserts, quote, my politics is born from it. As I riff on Dotson's sense of orienting stories, I'm mindful that her stories and histories are not my own. Indeed, Dotson herself makes clear that the orienting stories she shares are rooted in the specificity of her own ancestral histories and experiences of Blackness and are not universalizable, but rather are produced by varying relationships and proximities to entangled systems of power and domination. Indeed, these intimacies generate their own orienting stories. placing Dotson's insights about the multiplicity of Black experiences in conversation with other communities who have been racialized as inferior by the structural afterlives of slavery and ongoing colonial presence. In my work, I take up La Llorona as an orienting historia that is rooted in my own peopled histories and senses of self. La Llorona is an originating force for my decolonial feminist politics. As an orienting historia, Llorona's haunting offers lessons and demands root work and accountability as she imparts a memory to me that extends beyond my own lifespan. La Llorona calls to me, beckons me to grapple with my positionality as a settler Chicanx, a fraught positionality that Susie Zepeda has described as both, quote, being systematically subjected to racist colonization, land theft, and conquest, and as participating in the conquest and disappearance of Native peoples, close quote. As La Llorona teaches me, I faithfully bear witness to these incommensurabilities and contradictions without seeking absolution, as my body straddles the myriad fractures of the colonial difference. And this practice of faithful witnessing is another of the lessons that I glean from the orienting historia of La Llorona. According to Maria Lugones, who develops this concept in Pilgrimages, Peregrinajes in the introduction, to witness faithfully requires developing sensibilities and sensitivities to multiple worlds of sense and ways of being, as she describes them, against the grain of oppression. Indeed, as Yolmaira Figueroa Vasquez has explained, quote, faithful witness as a decolonial feminist tool makes visible the often unseen consequences of the coloniality of power, knowledge, and gender, close quote. Faithfully witnessing collective instances of trauma, particularly the annihilative violence of settler coloniality, requires that we attend to what we are being called on to remember and to reconstruct memories that are longer than our lifespans. It's precisely this memory work that, as I envision her, La Llorona calls for in her demand for faithful witnesses. All right, so that's a little bit about the frameworks, and I'm going to bring these frameworks to bear now as I start to think through the kind of politics that emerges from engaging with La Llorona as an orienting historia and thinking how that orients us toward a decolonial feminist politics of mourning. So drawing on these senses of faithful witnessing from Lugones and Figueroa Vasquez, I want to return to the orienting question of this talk. Who does Llorona cry for today? And to this question, I want to add, how does Llorona orient us toward a decolonial feminist politics of mourning? Asking this question demands that we move against the grain of oppression in order to faithfully witness La Llorona's haunting. Through faithful witnessing, we are required to reattend to Llorona's story to assess the motivations of her infanticide anew. Rather than condemn her eternally, as the moral order of settler coloniality urges us to do, faithful witnessing enables an understanding of La Llorona's act of infanticide as one of defiance to regimes of colonial power. As Sonia Saldívar-Hull has argued, quote, the infanticide is not an act by an insane or an insanely jealous woman, but rather it's a rational and political act of opposition against the Spanish colonizers, close quote. In offering such a risky interpretation that goes against common sense, we bear witness to the structural conditions of violence that necessitated such an act, and we can conceive of La Llorona's act of infanticide as a form of political resistance that subverts visions of settler futurity. Defying the denials and erasures of colonial unknowing, La Llorona's haunting interjects into our present and demands an active reckoning. Colonial unknowing, as Vimilastri et al. Have argued, is an epistemological orientation. Orientations through their repetition and reproduction are a constitutive force. As Sarah Ahmed has argued, orientations emerge through repetitions and reproductions that are worn over space and time, shaped by what we tend toward in our daily practices and desires. As an epistemological orientation, which is to say a well-worn way of knowing that has become habitual and faded into the unexamined background of daily living, colonial unknowing is reproduced through the always already becoming mundane norms of settler coloniality. Far beyond ambivalent forgettings or hidden aspects of the past, colonial unknowing is an orientation that, as Vimilastri et al. Argue, is, quote, aggressively made and reproduced, affectively invested, and effectively distributed in ways that conform the social relations and economies of the here and now, close quote. Indeed, as Maria Lugones has argued, the task of the decolonial feminist begins by acknowledging the structuring force of coloniality in our here and now, and, quote, emphatically resisting the epistemological habit of erasing it, close quote. Which is to say, the decolonial feminist task begins with confronting colonial unknowing. Through her haunting, La Llorona stages a confrontation with the active denials and erasures of colonial unknowing. As Avery Gordon writes in Ghostly Matters, quote, the whole essence, if you can use that word, of a ghost is that it has a real presence and demands its due, your attention, close quote. Demanding our attention, La Llorona refuses to be abandoned, forgotten, or ignored. And I want to suggest further that La Llorona's insistence on publicly grieving and her demands for faithful witness impart lessons about enacting a decolonial feminist politics of mourning. Grief is an unruly affect that is suppressed by the maintenance of colonial unknowing. La Llorona's refusal to calm down or to get over her grief is, I want to suggest, instructive in this moment. Indeed, grief can be both an orienting and reorienting force and a way of knowing otherwise. In their introduction to the recent special issue of Meridians on feminist politics of mourning, editors Brown and Puri theorize a feminist politics of mourning that conceptualizes mourning beyond individualized experiences of loss, and instead sees mourning as a collective condition that enacts an ethics of community care. As they explain, quote, as a feminist analytic, mourning contends with the social and political conditions that exacerbate death, modulating which lives can be socially grieved, and when grieving becomes a concerted state of being. Mourning is our response to a world in which death is tied to the structures of race, sexuality, gender, class, disability, religion, nation, and more, close quote. By enabling collective forms of grief work for attending to loss and suffering, Brown and Puri argue that mourning is an orientation to the world that contains the, quote, seeds for renewal and enacts connectivity in forms of, quote, affective kinship. Daily, we experience the reproduction of the normalized orientations of colonial unknowing as we are urged to move on from the pandemic and forget the over 1 million deaths and ongoing disabling effects of long COVID so that we can rejoin capitalism's demands to be good and unreflective consumers. Urged to disengage and suppress our heartbreak, grief, and anger over witnessing mass genocides and settler colonial violence unfold live streamed to our phone screens. And urged not to think too deeply about how capitalist extractivism and militarization of settler coloniality are implicated in the uptick of record-breaking storms, earthquakes and floods, and wildfires, and to allow ourselves to feel the grief of living in times of climate crisis and mass die-offs that threaten the earth and all her inhabitants. Where and how can we make space to come together to grieve these compounding losses? How might we learn to become lloronas, unafraid to publicly weep, to disrupt, insist on taking space, and to loudly cry out or sob uncontrollably and mourn? How might we enact grief work that begins to faithfully witness these wounds, palliating them through our llantos, and sowing and watering seeds for other futures beyond colonization? So, to dwell just a bit with these questions, I want to share a couple of stories about the lessons that La Llorona has taught me about engaging in a decolonial feminist politics of mourning by insisting on public spaces of grieving in what can sometimes feel like impossibly heavy times. This story starts with an ofrenda that first began as an offering to La Llorona and was transformed into an altar and space of remembrance for the lives lost to genocidal violence genocidal colonial violence in Palestine, Congo, Haiti, Sudan, and across the world. The first instantiation of the altar, which is pictured here on the slide, began with an invitation that I received to facilitate a local event in my community, a public-facing event for Dia de los Muertos, early last November. During the event, I engaged in storytelling about La Llorona, as well as the building of a public ofrenda. And though ofrendas are usually dedicated to one's own ancestors or public figures, I dedicated this ofrenda to La Llorona. In building the altar, I lovingly placed watermelons and children's toys, and I extended an invitation to others to reflect and make their own offerings. I included a framed printout of the question, who does Llorona cry for today? With a response in smaller text that reads, Llorona cries for those whose lives have been cut short by genocidal colonial violence. A few days later, at the suggestion of my colleagues, I repurposed and rebuilt this altar in the GWS house at Illinois, pictured here on the screen. And the ofrenda has been in place at GWS since November. And here we are 7 months later, and these public spaces of grieving are more needed than ever, as the death toll in Gaza has risen to 36,096 people, as estimated by the Gaza Ministry of Health. A number that Palestinian reporters on the ground, like Bisan Auda, estimate to be well over 40,000 at this point, over half of whom are children. In these last 236 days, I have felt possessed by La Llorona's presence, as I have been haunted by these scenes of genocide. And I know that I'm not alone. I'm in good company with a growing number of others who are committed to taking action to move toward collective liberation and decolonization. En estos tiempos, somos lloronas. In these times, we are all lloronas. The mass resistance across the globe to having genocide carried out in our names and funded by our governments with our tax dollars continues to grow as we demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire, an end to the occupation, and a free Palestine. As I participated in these resistance efforts, I want to connect the idea that somos lloronas to the wisdom carried in some of the protest chants that have been raised recently in collective actions, two of which are here on the screen. In our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians, and all children are our children. There's something powerful in this resistant identification. And rather than interpret these statements as flattening of difference or reinforcing disingenuous liberal affirmations about an alleged shared humanity, I want to suggest that we understand these declarations as a refusal of the isolating and fragmenting forces of colonial unknowing that underscores the interconnectedness of our struggles for liberation, as well as the knowledge that, as James Baldwin wrote in his prescient 1980 essay, Notes on the House of Bondage, written during an election year with Reagan and Jimmy Carter, actually, quote, "The children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. And I am beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality." And it's this deep knowing about our interconnectedness and interdependence that was exemplified in a recent action carried out by mamas and caregivers organizing with the Brooklyn Families for Palestine. During this action and in the face of arrest, these 16 protesters formed a circle, kneeled in the streets of Manhattan during rush hour, and engaged in an act of public mourning. As they described their actions in an Instagram post, each kneeled and cradled a shroud, a tribute to Samia Al-Atrash, who was photographed in this position whispering final goodbyes to her 2-year-old niece, Masa. Masa, along with a 4-year-old sister, Lina, were killed by Israel in October during the ongoing US-backed genocide of the Palestinian people. We are running out of ways to express our grief and rage, but still we rise up. We kneel to the earth because we know that earth is the caregiver we must learn from. We position ourselves in a circle because we know we are all connected, that the liberation of Palestine is bound to the liberation of Haiti, Sudan, the DR Congo, and beyond. We know that all children are our children. Don't stop fighting for a free Palestine until we take another street to end this genocide. And here I just want to take a moment to express my solidarity with the courageous student activists at my home institution at the U of I, at Columbia and Barnard, across the country here in Montreal, where there are active encampments that the students are continuing to call for divestment and a free Palestine. So I know that I am running out of time. So by way of conclusion, I just want to think briefly about the visions and strategies of justice that La Llorona's haunting might teach us, which is to ask, what does justice in the face of 500 years of continuing colonial violence look like or even mean? In A Glossary of Haunting, Tuck and Ree offer reflections on ghostly visions of justice by exploring motivations like revenge, which are often rendered taboo by the theorizations of justice found in Eurocentric traditions of political philosophy. As they write in 2 passages I'd like to offer up for our collective consideration, And I'll just read them both. Unruly, full of desire, unsettling around the edges of haunting whisper revenge. The rage of the dead, a broken promise, a violent ruin, the seeds of haunting, an engine for curses. It can and cannot be tolerated, not like justice. Everyone nods their head to justice. Who can disagree with justice? Revenge, on the other hand, revenge is necessarily unspeakable to justice. And then the next quote, over our lifetimes, you and I have been told in many different ways that we should try to right wrongs, and certainly never wrong wrongs. Revenge is wronging wrongs, a form of double wronging. You, like me, have been guided and good girled away from considering revenge as a strategy of justice. La Llorona is a haunting presence that refuses to be deferred, delayed, or put to rest. And thinking through these quotes on revenge, in response, we, like Chela Vargas, must ask Llorona, ¿Qué más quieres? What more do you want? A fearfully wrought question that already suspects that the ghost wants more than we might be willing and perhaps even able to give. We who faithfully bear witness to her historia must face that her answer is yes. La Llorona wants more. She wants, she desires, she demands more. Demands that settler nation states be dismantled. Demands that we refigure and revolutionize our moral orders to make space for her. Demands that we find ourselves implicated in her historia. La Llorona, in the words of Dotson, demands breaks and not compromises. Her spectral presence demands the deep structural transformations of decolonization, not the extractive and assimilative tendencies that accompany neoliberal visions of justice. And so I want to suggest that by taking up the task of decolonial feminisms, we must be willing to undergo disorientations and reorientations. As my friend Esme Murdoch often says, solidarity costs you something. Llorona's own radical act of refusal and resistance to settler futurity demands something of us. And I want to suggest that one of the ways to reflect on this is that we ask ourselves, what am I willing to give up, alchemize, and transmute to germinate otros mundos, or other worlds? What might be possible when we give up quests for absolution? Our good girl tendencies trained to seek out forms of social justice that seek reformation rather than transformation of dominant systems of power and domination. What happens when we grapple with our own desires for revenge? How can revenge be a strategy of justice when it moves against the grain of oppression? And in these questions, and this is the last slide, I hear the voices of revolutionary Black feminists like Angela Davis and Kathleen Cleaver, who have incisively diagnosed the depth of racist colonial unknowing that often levels charges of violence against those who resist centuries-long forms of enduring dispossession, domination, and oppression. Our everyday conditions are saturated by violence that generates ghosts, past, present, future. And La Llorona's haunting presence, a ghost produced by colonial genocidal violence, disorients settler futurity and reorients us toward decolonial futures beyond colonization. So I want to end with a call to action. May we, those of us dedicated to our collective liberation, commit to enacting our own disruptive hauntings as beings becoming future ghosts. As Ree and Tuck promise, quote, I am a future ghost. I am getting ready for my haunting. Indeed, in committing to becoming future ghosts, we are, as Ansaldúa foretold, called on to act. And so I just want to close with a little snippet of a poem from Ansaldúa. I am the daughter of La Llorona, and I am Llorona herself. I am the monster's child and the monstrous. La Llorona wailing, beckoning, and encouraging the artist, and here I would say the philosopher, to rail against injustices. She calls me to act. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.